Hi, everybody. I wanted to do a quick little intro to introduce the guest for the upcoming podcast, Dr. Frank Tortorello. You can find him on LinkedIn, and I'm going to have a number of links to a lot of his writings. Frank and I get into a number of topics, and we really got into the morality of decision making. I wanted to go further into policing, but we spent so much time on it. I think it's laying the groundwork. So we're going to have another episode coming up, and we'll get a little bit more into policing. But I do hope you enjoy it. And if you would, leave me a message on the podcast, wherever you get your podcast, or go to Policing in America podcast on YouTube and leave me a message, maybe with some questions you'd like to ask more specifically. So thank you. And with that, enjoy the podcast. Hi, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the Policing in America podcast with Sergeant Tom. I'm your host, Sergeant Tom, and today I'm very excited to tell you about the guest that I have today. It's Dr. Frank Tortorello. Dr. Frank is a strategist. He's an author. He's a coach. He runs his own coaching. It looks like your own coaching company, which I just realized, which is amazing. Dr. Frank Tortorello has a expertise on stress management, PTSD, all of which a body of work was done with the military. And I'm looking to see the parallels in law enforcement. And we're going to talk with Dr. Frank Tortorello on his work and talk a little bit more about the neuroscience. Some of you know that I have a whole block of work I'm doing on the neuroscience of de-escalation. So I'm very curious to see where Dr. Frank Tortorello teaches me a little bit about how we may be over neurologizing some of this. So I'm excited to learn. I hope you are too. And with that, Frank, anything you'd like to say before we start?
Well, yes, thanks, Tom. I really appreciate the opportunity and really looking forward to this conversation. I think anything that helps to bring some clarity to the idea of how and why people do things and end up with things that sound like almost like diseases or viruses when you talk about stress. That's always an interesting conversation. And that's what a lot of my work was focused on, is trying to understand how it is that people fit with their own brains. So some of what you and I have talked about a little bit in the past, Tom, is the issue of what role does neurology play exactly in the generation of stress. And there's, as you know, there's tons and tons of literature out there. What I'm interested in is the other side. What's the role of the person? Not the person's hormones, not the person's brain, not the person's neurology. And that's why I think you used the term over-neurologized. I think that's a great term, and perhaps we can explore that a little bit at your leisure.
So, okay. So I want to highlight some of your work because it's fascinating. And then we can sort of transition into policing because it's a similar but different family of military and policing. So can you just give us a little bit of background on some of the things you did with the military? I find it very fascinating. I think the listeners will too.
Sure. So I was interested in getting a doctorate in cultural anthropology, and I wanted to study courage. Essentially, that was a personal journey to try to find out if I had any. And one of the best places I thought you could possibly go was the American military. And then, of course, the Marine Corps, since courage is in their vernacular, in their motto, it's honor, courage, and commitment. And so I thought perhaps the Marines might be a great place to study the culture of courage, if there is one. Because actually, there are a lot of folks who think that courage and bravery and so forth are actually in some way hardwired or genetically based or evolved and built into our circuitry in some way. So I was very curious as to whether or not courage could be trained and whether or not courage was actually something that the Marines thought was trainable. And if so, how did they do it? So that started me off on the journey of trying to engage the Marine Corps. And I was able to successfully, through the generosity of a lot of Marine officers and a lot of Marine enlisted, actually participate in some of their training in which they have courage at the core of that training and leadership. And this got me thinking a little bit about stress. So if you're being courageous instead of being stressed, are you being courageous while you're being stressed? Is being courageous stressful? All those questions started to emerge since there is so much literature, as I mentioned before, about how we're really, I don't know if you want to use the word determined. That's a strong word, but there's a lot of talk out there that suggests that we are determined by what our biology does. And so we're almost like a victim of our own biology at moments. That's part of what I was doing with the Marine Corps. And after that, I was asked to, after I did my research, I was asked to actually be a contracted social scientist, helping the Marine Corps look at its training, its culture training. That led to an engagement with helping the Marine Corps look at its resilience doctrine and how that doctrine was getting institutionalized or not. That led to some further research with the Marines on stress and resilience. And after that, it's sort of a series of positions in which I ended up helping the Marine Corps stand up its first counter insider threat program. Because of course you don't want to set up a security program. Yeah, you don't want to set up a security program that is that undermines the trust that your culture rests upon, especially if you're a military organization. Marines have to trust one another, as I'm sure police officers do. If you don't trust one another because you're always looking out to see who's doing the wrong thing, then I think you have a problem.
That's fascinating. And there's a few terms. So the determinism, I'm going to circle back to it, and then the culture.
Okay.
So how do you define culture? Maybe that's too broad, or how do you look at culture?
Right. These are the practices. Culture is the practices that people embody. Right. So one of the things that's been a traditional mistake in Euro-American cultural thinking about that exact question, what is culture, has been this idea that we're of two different substances. One substance is the biology, and the other substance is this sort of amorphous, mysterious thing called the person. Mm-hmm. And that's actually, you have to get past that. And that's a whole other philosophical discussion that probably would bring us down a certain path, probably appropriate for a different kind of podcast. But once you engage with that and you learn that people are actually their language. So it's our language use and the way we use language that actually constitutes our culture. And I use language to include the way we move. So in the idiom of the Marine Corps, the language narratives of the Marine Corps, it's as important to move properly as it is to speak properly, because courage is an embodied value on the battlefield. It's rarely the kind of thing where you're actually speaking it, it's you're moving it. And what's that famous Marine Corps commercial? We run toward the sound of danger. We run toward the sound of the guns. And I'm sure it's very similar for firefighters and police officers.
Absolutely. And so now you've opened a door for me that I wasn't even thinking of. But so in policing, let's stick on courage for a moment, because this seems you have an expertise in this and you've studied it deeply. Mm-hmm. We look at courage in policing in a lot of different ways. And right now there's the courageous conversations. When you see an officer doing something wrong, or let's just not even say it's misconduct. Let's say it's trending that way. Mm-hmm. And we have programs now, maybe you're familiar with ABLE, active bystandership in law enforcement, and a duty to intervene. And yes, all of that tends to be surrounded by courage. But then you have inhibitors to courage. Have you found that phenomena to be the case in humanity as a species or in certain hierarchies?
I think anytime you're engaged with a species that has meaning at its core, and there is only one species that has the kind of meaning we have, and that's ours. We're unique in the animal world from that standpoint. That doesn't mean other animals don't act like they have a certain kind of ethic, but you don't see, for example, chimpanzees building churches. You don't see chimpanzees building synagogues or temples or anything like that. So there's a radical difference between us and the rest of the animal kingdom from that standpoint. There would be people, I'm sure, who would disagree wholeheartedly with that. But that's the way that goes in the way I was trained. The inhibitors, if you're going to talk about inhibitors to courage, often have to do with the moral values that you're living. So the idea that you're going to take a risk and, as they say, get above the radar, that's a moral risk. It's rarely a physical risk in let's say everyday American cultural life. Most people are negotiating their willingness to take a risk for being called out or detracted from or undermined or called to task for the values that they're expressing. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that you have these courageous conversations, it seems to me, has to center on the idea: am I going to risk, for example, confronting a coworker who props open a door that should not have been propped open because the security of all of us is at risk? Am I going to confront that person because, I don't know, I served with that person overseas, or that person did me a great favor, last week? Those are the kinds of things that impinge on, directly influence an ability to be courageous. And of course, the ability to be courageous is itself the idea that somebody is wanting to risk their values in order to achieve other values. So Marines, for example, will throw themselves on a grenade.
Right.
And who's that for? It certainly can't be for the Marine that's throwing him or her on the grenade.
Right.
It's for all the other Marines. So that's a particularly stark example of how your embodiment, you can use your body to speak. So when you're throwing yourself on a grenade, you're actually saying to the rest of the Marines, I value you more than me.
Wow.
And we have lots of variations of that in everyday life. Am I going to honk at the person who cut me off, or am I going to let them come in? Right?
Yeah.
All kinds of variations on that theme.
Now, how does that theme tie into courage?
So the way that I think the Marines look at, and probably police officers, they look at courage is, am I going to risk myself, whether that's my values, parts, or my whole body? Am I going to risk that for some larger value or for some interest? Some people will risk themselves or their values for their self-interest. They'll risk going to jail in order to make money.
Interesting.
So this isn't necessarily all good, so to speak. Courage is not necessarily all good. So one of the conversations I was lucky enough to be involved in with Marines was a conversation about whether or not our overseas adversaries had courage. And so is it courageous to stick your AK-47 around the corner of a building and put it on full automatic and fire indiscriminately into a crowd because there's an American patrol there? Is that courageous?
I'd say no.
And a lot of the Marines would agree. From the standpoint of the adversary's culture, is it courageous? Well, they certainly honor people who do things like that. Wow. So now we have an issue.
Yes.
Because if courage is built in and it's hardwired, then where's that variation come from? It should be species wide, right? That makes sense?
Yeah, it does. It does, right? So I'm looking at it from the perspective of the instinct to protect, like a mama bear, like a mama grizzly bear's instinct to protect is unchallenged. So, you watch some of these TV shows like Alone or one of them, and a wolverine or one of these small animals comes, that a bear would win the fight, but it's not worth it. So the bear leaves, or the bear leaves with noise, but the bear can easily handle itself. But when it comes to the cub, you don't see mama bears running away. It is innate in the species. The mother will be as violent as necessary to protect the species or the offspring. Right. So that is, like you're saying, that's consistent across the species. Now, with us, there's variations of that. And did you have a thought on that? Because I was going to push on to something.
Right. How do we explain the variation?
So now, without getting too deep into it, because I don't have all the knowledge, you have a group of people, we're going to call them society or citizens, who look at what happened in, say, Uvalde, Texas, for example, and they're going to say these officers lacked courage. Because you have parents who are not armed, not body-worn vests, ballistic vests, trying to get to danger, right? The mama bear.
Yep.
And you have people who are ready for this, who are standing by. And for whatever reason, we could talk about the tactics or the plan, but it certainly looks as though there was very little courage there without I'm not trying to demonize the people, but I'm saying as an example, as an outsider looking in, we're going to look at that and say there's no courage.
Right. And that's exactly an illustration of how courage in our culture has an embodied component. So what I mean by that is you can actually look at a situation and make a judgment as to whether or not those people have courage simply by the way they are moving in a context, or in this case, not moving.
Yes.
So do you remember the great movie Saving Private Ryan?
Sure.
And the first 10, 15 minutes when they're assaulting Omaha Beach.
Yeah.
If those soldiers went back toward the ocean, what would we think of them?
Yeah.
And when I ask veterans to tell me whether or not they see courage in those scenes, they say, well, of course. And then you say, well, how can you tell? Well, they're going toward the machine guns. They're going toward the beach. So in this case, it would be very easy to say, if you didn't go toward the school, you didn't have courage. But I think we know that there are certain kinds of very important considerations. You don't want to make a situation like that worse.
Yeah.
You don't. And, this is out of my league. This is directly in your wheelhouse, Tom. I wouldn't know what those processes and procedures are, but I'm sure there are some. And so the first thing I would look at as an anthropologist are what are the conversations that would be involved in people's expectations that something should have happened and didn't. What got in the way of the what should have happened and didn't happen? What were the conversations that got in the way amongst the people who were there? And there may be very good reasons why those conversations got in the way. And I'll bet that those conversations had to do with value judgments. Had nothing to do with instinct, has nothing to do with hormones, has nothing to do with brains, and has everything to do with the way we talk to one another about what we should do. It's a moral conversation.
Okay. This is a good segue into, let me try to pull this into something that everybody saw around the world with George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd and Derek Chauvin. And so was it from as a researcher, not as, as a purely researcher perspective, the issue that was happening, why officers didn't pull Derek Chauvin off? They were making a value judgment. They valued their own safety, can we say, within the hierarchy over the safety of the citizen.
It could be. It could be something more personal. So I don't know about the actual interpersonal relationship between the officers. And there could be a phrase in there that I would listen for. Let's say I was interviewing all the officers in charge or all the officers involved. One of the things I would listen for is, hey, he's a scary guy. That's a different kind of issue than he's the sergeant. He knows what he's doing.
Right.
I need to follow orders. Those are different to me. There are qualitative differences there. They're all moral judgments and their decisions, but those are different. They're of a different quality, and it explains something different depending on what I would hear about who the person is who's making the statement. So somebody could say, hey, I don't want to get involved. And just my head movement there and the way I've, and the tone of my voice, that tells you something about my judgment, doesn't it? But if I said, hey, Sergeant Tom, come on, you know this guy. I don't want to cross this guy. That's a whole different presentation.
Yeah,
what is the difference in that quality? That's what we could and should be looking for. And by the way, that nuance, that is entirely eliminated if you only look at hormones and brains.
Okay. Okay. So with that idea of hormones and brains, and then I'm going to see if I can pull this together. Following orders, that seems to be paramount in the military and in policing. And I will sometimes put forth that following orders will hamper an officer's critical thinking ability. Because we end up with terms like lawful but awful, because you look at what happened with Rashard Brooks in Atlanta, and I believe the Atlanta PD had a similar policy like other agencies. When you have a DUI, It's a mandated arrest, much like the domestic violence is a mandated arrest, irrespective of how big the damage is or to the person. It's a mandated arrest. So you put an officer in a position to say, look, nobody was hurt, nobody was harmed, the person fell asleep. I could probably mitigate this pretty easily and everyone go on their way. But no, now I have to put you into custody. I'm not allowed to think anymore. I have to follow orders. And then whatever happens from that, the fight, the ensuing OIS, people think you're shooting somebody who fell asleep behind the wheel. And the officer is saying, I'm shooting somebody who's fighting me. And we can't seem to get those across. What are your takes on the importance of following orders, but then that's inherent ability to seem to limit a critical thinking component?
I think that's what you're saying is exactly right. That's the tension. When you take away people's judgment and you want them to act as if they're robots, and we are not, you're taking away that flexibility. Now, there may be good reason to take away flexibility in certain situations. So I'll give you a parallel conversation I had with Marines. Marines, especially enlisted Marines, when I asked them what they were looking for in their junior Marines or recruits, they would say instantaneous obedience to orders.
Wow.
Then I would say, and that's important because, and they give me a whole host of reasons. We don't need, junior folks questioning what's going on in the middle of a firefight, or whether or not they should be pulling a trigger, and so on. And I then would ask, well, it's definitely instantaneous obedience to orders, right? That's what I heard you say, and absolutely. Yeah. And I said, what about the illegal orders? What are your Marines supposed to do when they hear an illegal order? Well, they're not supposed to follow it. So even when you want them to be acting automatically, you still want them to be exercising judgment. They have to exercise judgment. They have to make a decision because they have to decide that the order is legal or not. So we can't get behind that and automate it. Do you see what I mean? You can't get behind the automation and automate the allegiance to the automation. You have infinite regress. Well, no, I always want you to do this in this situation. And the Marines will say, well, even when there's an illegal order? Well, no, not when there's okay, you just follow that back. Right. How do you know which orders are illegal or not? Well, we train you about that. So then your Marines are exercising judgment no matter how junior they are. Yes, they are. They're always exercising judgment.
And you want that?
Yes, I think so.
I would agree.
Yeah.
So then if you want them exercising judgment, you don't want that regressive sort of thinking. Explain to myself and the listeners this idea of, to me, that sounds like a neurological response, because certain parts of the brain are going to light up and they're going to control the release of the hormones. They're going to control the emotionality, to borrow the idea of Kahneman and system 1 and system 2. So to me, it seems like the genesis of this all stems from the brain. But we talked before, and it taught me that it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of the best way to illustrate this. So we know there's a couple of facts of the matter when it comes to the way we're built as a species and as a person. If you don't have a brain, you don't have a person.
Yeah.
That's clear, right? So we need that. We know we need the brain. The real question is whether it's the brain that's in charge and under what circumstances. So my suggestion is to look at the relationship between our neurology and, let's call it, our personhood on a spectrum. And way to the left is no brain, no person. And way to the right is what would be the kind of thing that would illustrate the idea that we can overcome what we'd otherwise think are the dictates of our neurology. What would be an example of that? Well, I would point to what some Marines do on battlefields and what some police officers do out on the street and what some firefighters do. You would think that when they are as stressed as they are, they would not be able to function. And what do we mean by that, as stressed as they are? So let's say we have a Marine sniper who's taking direct fire. And you would think that if we had an instinct for self-preservation, that Marine sniper would change position. Instead, the Marine sniper continues to remain in position despite the fire because he feels he has an obligation, a duty to protect the Marines he's providing overwatch for. So how do we explain that from the standpoint of biology? So we know biology is important, but is it important in the way we often think, which is like a one-to-one relationship, like the brain controls the person? It's an operations center of a sort. But look, here's another analogy. When planetary physicists talk about the magnetic field around the Earth, right?
Yeah.
You don't explain what the magnetic field does in terms of the metallic alloys at the core of the Earth that generate the field. The field is its own thing. So why do we insist in lots of cases about talking about the brain as if the person was not its own thing?
Huh. That's fascinating. I love the magnetic field analogy. Whenever we can bring astronomy into it. Yeah. Yeah. I love it. So the person, they're Dr. Joe Dispenza. Are you familiar with that name?
I'm not. I'm sorry.
Okay. No. He has a few different books. One of them that's getting a lot of popularity right now is Breaking the Habit of Becoming Yourself. Oh. And he talks about how the brain will set forth this sort of patternistic behavior. And you fall into this cognitive trap of saying, well, I'm this kind of person. And he says, in order to change that neurological structure, you need to start thinking that you are this other person instead. And then we could start changing the neurological pathways. Mm-hmm. Because if I just say, well, I'm somebody that has a bad memory, I'm in a sense a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if you tell yourself, I'm somebody who's constantly working on my memory and I have a good memory. Well, a person with a good memory takes notes, and a person with a good memory sets reminders or whatever it is. And then you start living that out. And I'm wondering how that transcends into the military and then policing. If you constantly tell yourself, I am a noble police officer, well, then this is how a noble police officer should act. And then you're changing maybe that chemistry, that chemical response of that system one. It doesn't matter what system one's doing because I am this way and the body's going to push through. Is that inarticulate maybe or too sloppy?
No. I think it's interesting exactly because there's an interest in trying to keep the brain involved, as if it's the talk about the brain that's really important. What if we dropped, if we go back through this recording, Tom, and we drop all of your references to the brain and we just stuck with what you were talking about, which is how people talk to themselves? And we just start and stop with that. What's the brain have to do with it? Why don't we generate those patterns? What I would say from a cultural anthropological standpoint, as opposed to, let's say, a neurologist of a certain stripe, I would say that it's because we value those conversations about those patterns, right? So, and let's take it, that spectrum I was talking about before, let's go around the middle, which is, let's say, somebody who's addicted to alcohol or somebody who's addicted to nicotine, right? Is that a biological issue or is that a person issue? Well, actually, it's a little of both.
Yeah.
Because I know I'll go through a certain kind of withdrawal and a certain kind of physical pain and discomfort if I stop either one of those two substances. But we have examples all the time of people going cold turkey.
Right.
So who's in charge here? Is it the brain or is it the person? And if we think it's the brain, even in cases where we have a substance that's impacting the biology, then why don't we concentrate just on the people and how they talk to themselves? And you can actually watch this play out when you or listen to it play out when you read accounts by Marines or Army, Navy, Air Force. It doesn't matter. People doing incredible things. They will often say something, give you a hint as to how they were talking to themselves. And that talk is often about what they think they need to do or should do. It's moral talk. So if I don't like the kind of person I am, I can always choose to adopt a different narrative for myself at any point in time. And it can be like that. It doesn't have to be a long time, then you say, well, how come it seems so hard? Mm-hmm. It's because we are embodied, and we do live by values, and there's nested values and mutually impacting values, and values that reinforce and undermine each other, and we can be very conflicted. And so when a Marine says, I'm so stressed, I didn't bring home all of my Marines alive, and I'm gonna run together two examples that I have. That kind of talk, and then you wear a memory bracelet that's metal. Right. And so every time you touch your desk or your keyboard, you hear a little. So you're always reminding yourself of the conversation about who you failed to be. Wow. What's the brain have to do with that? We have a complete explanation without having to revert to anything neurological. We may suspect, in fact, we know there's something neurological going on. We have to have a brain, and it has to be more or less functioning, although it can be less functioning, for people to be people. Right? People lose parts of their brain, they get tumors, and they still more or less pull off being a person. Mm-hmm. So why is the brain always such a central role in these explanations is kind of my question. Why don't we talk about the morality of all this? Who we want ourselves to be and what conversations we're allowing ourselves to have with ourselves and with each other.
It's fascinating. When you say morality, mm-hmm. is there a certain space of morality, be it ideological, religious? Like, how do you view morality?
It's whatever we value. And here's where it gets a little, it's hard to articulate, because there's rarely anything we do as a species that you can't attribute some kind of value orientation to. So I'm going to go to sleep now. It's actually a value orientation. It's a decision. Mm-hmm. If I was to get up and walk away from this interview, that's a value decision. If I decided simply to sit here for the rest of the afternoon, that's a value decision, value-oriented decision. So it's hard to say what isn't morality. But you know, when folks want to explain why people do things, there is something in our culture, which would be probably at another podcast, about how it's biology that really determines who, not just what we are, but who we are. And that has a long, long tradition in European and American culture and the way we think. And so we're always looking for it. So Stephen Paddock, the guy who shot all of those poor people in Las Vegas, mm-hmm. When they failed to find what might be understood as a usual explanation for why he did what he did, 52, 58 people, whatever it was, and then hundreds wounded, they took his brain and they sent it to an outstanding neurologist looking for why he did what he did. Wow. Now, why would you think that you're going to find it literally in the brain? Even if there was a tumor, even if they discovered some kind of degenerative, process going on in his brain, why do we think that would be a sufficient explanation when we actually have another one, but it's one that really scares people? He did it because he wanted to do it. And that could have been, a conversation he was having for him about himself, for himself, that nobody else was privy to. I'm the kind of person who's going to be remembered. You didn't have to write that down in order for us to know that that's an option for somebody like that. I'm going to do something that I feel like doing. That's all in our species. That's all we need. It doesn't have to be a deep, complex, interesting issue.
So it's, oh my gosh. So it challenges a lot of my own assumptions, but the fact that you said it's a spectrum, right? So that helps me to understand that, sure, the brain is controlling things. We know that if there's no brain, there's no person. But the idea of, and tell me if you know this, or if I'm speaking out of turn here, the brain of certain criminals, mm-hmm. they have certain overdeveloped parts of the brain. You could see similarities in someone who would be a sociopath or a psychopath, or the idea that a tumor could press up against an area in the prefrontal cortex, which could change their personality. Are those things part of the conversation as well?
I think they have to be. And they're important parts of the conversation. The question is exactly how do they play into this? And that leads us to the question of what exactly are those studies that demonstrate this? And what are the assumptions in those studies? So, for example, MRIs and fMRIs, which have been used quite extensively to sort of prove that certain areas of the brain light up, and that seems to give certain neurologists and medical doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists an idea that this must be the part of the brain that controls this or that. But there are other studies that show, with equally interesting evidence and equally powerful evidence, that you can't locate a behavior in any one part of the brain. So what does the amygdala do? Well, it actually does a lot of things. Sometimes the studies act as if you can pick one behavior and attribute that to the amygdala. Now, that's sort of old-fashioned. A lot of very good neurologists are doing some very interesting work. I don't mean to imply that there's not any way to do this, but it's got to be much more nuanced than it is. So let me see if I can bring it back to something that's readily available. Let me ask you this question, Tom. Do you think that the shaking, and that's a behavior, it's a certain kind of behavior, shaking because you have Parkinson's disease is the same thing as shaking because it's your wedding day?
It would seem like the signal that's sending the electrical impulse to the nerves that's going to do that is very similar, but the genesis of each one is different. One is due to a broken, I don't want to say broken, but say a damaged neurotransmitter or pathway. And the other one is because of a heightened sense of nerve. So your heart's beating and your body has to do something with that energy.
And what's the source of that second one?
So that's going to be the stress
of
the moment, maybe the nerves and the thought of whatever those thoughts might be. Am I making the right decision, or should I not be here, or whatever those thoughts are to elicit that stimuli?
So you just identified the heart of a lot of what I write about, which is what is the actual cause of this behavior? And cause is a tricky term, because a cause in the physical world is really different than a cause in the moral, cultural world. So I would say that shaking because it's your wedding day has everything to do with the meaning that you attribute to getting married. But shaking because you have Parkinson's disease has nothing to do with morality.
Right. Right.
The second one does. It has everything to do with morality. So I think you're exactly right. It's the same delivery system, so to speak, radically different causes.
Interesting. Now, so can we train these moral lenses by which the Marines view their purpose? Yep. You know, the one who says the sniper is not to move because my duty is to them and come what may. But yet we have this downward pressure of follow orders, you know, relentlessly. So can we create these people that have these moral judgments or these moral lenses through which to make better judgments under stress?
I think police officers, firefighters, all our first responders, military, they do it all the time. We've just missed it, and we continue to train ourselves to miss it by acting as if biology is in charge. Wow.
So just taking one that is always a hot button topic, the concepts of implicit bias. And that sounds like, and I have both respect for the science behind it, but I also have some disappointment because it tells me a lot, but doesn't tell me much.
Yeah.
So it tells you there's a subconscious process going on that may or may not impact my external decisions.
Yep.
So, okay, it's interesting. It's neat. Police officers go through the training, but the needle never moves on behavior. Mm-hmm. So to follow that up, should we take that training, but then impart on it some other type of what to do now with it and make that around your own value, moral self-talk in a sense?
Yep. So this is really interesting, and I'm trying to figure out a way that I can try and make what I'm thinking available. So maybe so first I'd say, yes, absolutely. There's a way that you can pay attention to it and make it move the meter. Wouldn't it be something like, and let's get rid of subconscious and all of that sort of thing. Let's call it something like, it's a habit.
Okay.
What if we take out all the technical stuff like subconscious, unconscious, in hardwired, all those references, and instead we just say it's a habit. It's a habit for me not to pay attention to the yellow light because I know I can get away with it in 9 out of 10 cases, and people generally move, and I'm busy.
Sure.
How would you teach people to pay more attention to the yellow light? Oh. It seems a similar thing, doesn't it? Sort of. So that where it gets pretty complex, it occurs to me, is when you realize that people and who they are is wrapped up in their values. And so for somebody to say, I'm not the kind of person who would speed up when I see the yellow light, but then you clock them and you show them, then it's a confrontation. And now the question is, what's the narrative? What you've given me is an opportunity to say to myself, what is the narrative? What is the kind of self-talk, what we're talking about before, what you were talking about before? What's the self-talk I'm using about who I think I am? I'm not the kind of person who speeds up at the yellow light, but look, I think, a lot of the implicit bias training is too general. Mm-hmm. It allows people to protect themselves. And so it's got to be more of an invitation, it would seem to me. And I'm riffing off the cuff here, Tom. I'd have to look at the particular programs out there and how they're being delivered. Who's delivering them is almost as important as what's being delivered. Sure. Their tone of voice, their stature. So I'll give you one really important example from the Marine Corps. You would never get Marines to listen to someone who is overweight. It will not happen. It doesn't matter whether they have the solution to hitting a target at 700 meters dead on first shot.
Right.
It doesn't work. Now, is that built in? Is that hardwired into Marines? Where in our species history might that have been developed? That's nonsense. Why talk like that? Instead, it's a habit. And it has to do with their value orientation over who can trust. Because for Marines, your physical presence and the way you carry yourself is an indication of your commitment to that culture's values. Yeah. Right. So they have, just by watching and looking, they can tell who they might want to trust right off the bat. And I would say in implicit bias training, you have a very complicated conversation that gets mixed up with a little too much reliance on words and terminology that help people to not really engage. It invites them to not engage. Instead, we'd say, well, we have habits. Mm-hmm. So how do we, this is just like, because we do have the evidence that there are such habits and lots of people do these things. They read a particular kind of name on a resume and they don't bother to interview the person. Right. Statistically, numerically, we have the evidence. So instead of calling it something that is so weighted and freighted with moral negativity, we can call it a habit. How do we break this habit? And why do we want to break the habit? That's the piece I'm not sure I understand in a lot of implicit bias training. Why do we want to change? Huh. Anybody ever explain that? Maybe you've come across, since you're, given what you do, Tom, you've come across some training that does that, that actually says, here's why we want to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, it's assumed that that everyone shares the moral outlook.
Right.
And that's not the case. That's never the case. And that's why, even the Marines, they get stuck because on the train trestle, I don't know if it's still there, on the train trestle that goes through Paris Island, the recruiting depot, it says, "We make Marines." I say, "Well, do you make Marines?" And he says, "Yeah, we make Marines." And I'll say, I'm going to tell you now how an anthropologist would put it. Mm-hmm. You invite people with civilian values to adopt your values and be 100% committed to them. You don't make Marines, you offer a way of life.
What a neat way of looking at that.
So I think the same thing is with implicit bias, or at least there's a possibility here, it seems to me. Yeah. What's the kind of life we're inviting you into with this training? Is that the kind of person you want to be? There seems to be an assumption that the answer is always yes.
Right.
Of course you want to be this person. Well, I mean, if you look at political discourse in our country today, you'll know right away that not everybody wants to be whatever that vision is.
Yeah.
On either side of that, whatever that means.
Yeah, for certain. Well, and Frank, you've given me something here that I now have to question myself, because I have a phrase that I often use, which is the world can be broken down into two people. Uh-huh. Those who see a yellow light and hit the brake, those who see a yellow light and hit the gas. And I am part of the latter. And so now I have to question that, because why do I embrace that so much? Why is it that when I see yellow light, I got to get through?
Yep.
And, at what expense though, right? Because like you said, I'm busy or I don't have time for this. And I am now going to look at that more deeply.
Yes.
So thank you for that. It's kind of a neat little realization. Now, when it comes to, so my area of focus is how can I take training and education, this coin, two sides. How do I take this and the knowledge that's out there and the research to help put officers in a position cognitively, emotionally, and physically in a position to make better decisions under stress?
That's if I could tell you that, I'd probably be making a mint right now, Tom. But one of the things that I know, when you were talking before, what gets in the way of courage, right?
Mm-hmm. There you go.
What gets in the way of, effective training? One is a serious lack of clarity about what people are, and therefore who they can be. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of mixed messaging in lots of training that picks up two very different and even contradictory ways of talking. One is, well, if it's all in my brain and it's all subconscious, how do you expect me to do anything about it?
Yes, exactly.
Right? So what's all that talk about? You're actually talking against the point of your training.
Yeah.
So that would be one area. But see, the danger, Tom, and I think this is where it gets extremely tricky, especially in European and American culture, is that once you enter the world of morality and you don't have a reference to what seems to be the objective science, people can doubt what you're saying.
Yeah.
And so that's what people, I think, feel. The trainers, the police chiefs, the firefighting leaders, they're concerned because we have so much practiced in our culture defending what we do and explaining what we do by reference to something that's out of our control. It was my hormones. It was my brain. It was my this. Yeah. It was my that. All in reference to the neurology that we've really not talked a lot about in the other, at least in the public sphere. So if you can believe it, one of the things that, I point out in the book I wrote about the Marine Corps stress and resilience training is that their stress and resilience doctrine actually contradicts their culture for exactly that reason, because it invites Marines to think that stress is going to happen to them no matter what. And my response is that's patently untrue, given what you see Marines actually do on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
and Marines, and we know this through, in fact, lots of military history. Not everybody is stressed by gunfire.
Right.
In fact, people get focused. So, pilots, there's something wrong with the plane. They don't get stressed, they get focused. Or they're using the stress in a way that's focused for the purpose, their duty, for a value orientation.
So, okay. So this is my thought. And I have a friend that we go over this ad nauseum. We want to stop making police officers, law enforcement officers. We want to create problem solvers. Because when a man with a knife appears, if their thought is my safety, my safety, my safety, well, then their focus becomes very narrow. But if they think of that as, how do I handle the problem of a man with a knife? Sure, my safety is a part of it, but their safety is a part of it too. Because people who feel safe don't often have to have knives in front of them. Right. So if we start looking at this just a little bit bigger, and we start opening up the way in which we teach people to be a problem solver, not just a compliance officer or somebody who's going to gain compliance. Am I at least trending in the right area from your perspective about how to start getting people out of that neurological trap?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say you make a good point of clarification. The focus that I'm referring to is focus that's based on, let's say, an appropriate value orientation. So for Marines who are, in a squad of Marines, especially infantry Marines, they have areas, literally physical spaces that they're supposed to watch when they're moving. And I have to trust the man or the woman behind me to be doing that regardless of whether they're hot, they're tired, they're whatever, in order for me to do my job. And that's why there's a social interdependence to the success of Marines. And I would say the same thing for police officers. So the focus isn't on the weapon, but the larger issue of, who is this person?
Yeah.
Why might they be scared? So you're saying that you're saying don't just focus. And so that's why I think what you're saying is a clarification of what I was contending. It's a deeper and better way of presenting it. Don't just focus on the weapon and then what that equates to in terms of your SOPs. Think about who this person is. Is this person, and this brings up again the issue of the training, it seems to me. How are we training people to focus, and what are they supposed to focus on? Because the more we try to give them SOPs that are supposed to be universal, the more we're going to go wrong, because there's innovation in the world and novelty in the world all the time. And you're never going to write a universal SOP. You always have to have the judgment we were talking about before. It's got to be there somewhere, including the judgment. When do I need to leave off of that focus and move to this focus? So the way that person is moving toward me with the knife, doesn't matter who he is.
Right. It's how they're moving, because that body language should be an indicator. Like, this motion is much different than this one here at the side. Or at the bottom, or pacing back and forth, as opposed to hands up, a knife in a fighting position. This is very different than here, sitting. And we need to look at the totality of that, because now as you say, we're now making this sort of moral. We're looking at it through the framework of that moral lens. What do I value about this? Do I value my inherent safety at all costs, or do I value getting this person the help they need, keeping other people safe, and at whatever cost that is, because this is who I choose to be. Right. So Frank, this is, I hate to hear, and I've never heard a Marine say this. I've never heard a firefighter. I hate when I hear police say, well, all cops want to do is go home at night, because that is a language that now sets up my thought process. What do warriors in the military say? We never leave somebody behind. It's almost presumed that people are going to die, and we will never leave you behind. But what do we say? Well, all we want to do is go home at night. Well, now I know where your value is.
I think that's exactly right.
And we need to change that language. In my opinion, that's a statement that does nobody any good.
If you want a different set of preferred actions,
if you want
amongst your police officers, if you want a certain set, if you want to include and exclude a certain set of actions on the part of your police officers, you'll say that. But if you want a different set of actions, then you'll say something differently, and you'll teach them a different mantra.
That's fantastic. Okay, I'm coming up on the hour, and I have to be cognizant of your time. But I feel just like last time, we barely scratched the surface, and I have so much more that I want to go on. So I'm going to start wrapping up with you, but I'm going to think of a bunch of questions that I'm going to send you, and maybe I can have you on a part 2, because I think everyone else, we've just started getting into this, and maybe we could do a part 2 next time in a few weeks.
Absolutely. Happy to help any way I can, Tom.
It's great. I really appreciate it, Frank. You're really brilliant in how you look at things, and you've given me a new way. I'm going to send you my neuroscience of de-escalation and ask for your feedback and see how I could better do this. I think we're onto something. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Happy to help.
Yeah. Thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing your knowledge.
No, thank you, Tom. Appreciate the opportunity.